Are you manually bumping your application's version whenever you want to do a release? Or do you have to manually specify whether you want to do a major, minor, or patch version bump for the release? I used to do this too, but I recently found a different approach that works really well. So right now we have our continuous deployment project that we've been building a deploy pipeline for with GitHub Actions. So in our deploy workflow right now, we're extracting whatever the version is from our CSproj file and using that as the version for our release. So everything here depends on us manually going into our CSproj file and updating our version. So doing this manually, of course, is tedious and error prone. And in a really large project, if you're releasing changes that tons of people have worked on, you probably don't know all the changes that are in the release, and you might not know what kind of semantic version bump to do. Is it a major bump? Is it a minor bump? And so on. So it'd be nice to have version bumps fully automated, and it'd be nice to automatically know which type of semantic versioning bump to do. And this is where this amazing tool I found called Changesets comes into play. So Changesets is a tool to manage versioning and changelogs with a focus on multi-package repositories. So it is kind of meant for mono repos, but it works really well for repositories that only have one project as well, which we'll see here. It also calls out changelogs, which is pretty nice. So it'll create a changelog for us with all of our changes. So we'll see that, but we really want to focus on versioning here. So basically the way this works is that every commit or PR can include something called a change set. So a change set is really just a file that describes the change that we're committing. And it'll also specify the type of semantic version bump that the change represents. So say if I create a pull request with a breaking change, which represents a major semantic version bump, then I would want to create a change set that describes that change and also marks my change as a major version bump. And on the other hand, if I have a pull request with just a bug fix or something, I'd probably want to mark that as a patch version bump. So then when we want to do a release and bump the version, we'd want to run change set version, which will automatically do the appropriate version bump based on our change sets. So following up with the previous example, if we had a major change and a patch change, then it would know that the next version bump needs to be a major change. So it'll update the version accordingly, and just like that, we have automatic versioning. Another thing to call out is that this is an npm package, so we'll have to manage the version in an npm package.json file. But of course, the docs do call out that you can really use this for anything. It even calls out .NET stuff here. Also, again, since it is an npm package, you'll need to download Node.js, which you can do here, and I'll link everything in the description that we talk about in this video. So moving back over to Visual Studio, let's get into this. So as I mentioned, Changesets is an npm package, so we'll have to manage it in an npm package.json file. Now, unfortunately, I don't have Node or npm set up on Windows, but I do have it set up in my Linux subsystem for Windows. So we're going to be playing around in here for a little bit. So right now I'm in the folder that contains my CSproj, and we're going to run an npm init, and we're going to tack on a -y here to just say yes to all of the prompts that it would hit us with. And there we go, we got our package.json file created in this directory. So now if I go back to Visual Studio, we can see the package.json was created. Now, as mentioned in the docs, we only really need a minimal package.json, so we can remove everything but name, private, and version. So we got name, version, let's delete everything else, and add private, true. And since this package.json is where the version is going to live, let's copy over our CSproj version to our package.json version. All right, so now we have to initialize change sets. So we're going to copy this command from the docs. Again, all of this will be in the video description. If it's not, you can yell at me in the comments. But let's copy this and run this command at the root of our project. So we're going to install the changeset CLI in our project and then run changeset init. All right, looks like it installed and initialized. So we can see changesets was added as a dependency, and we have this .changeset folder with a readme and our config.json. We shouldn't have to change anything here. One thing I will change is the base branch. So if I do a git status, I'm on my main branch, which is actually master. So I'm going to update this to master, sorry, but we should be good there. All right, so let's do a quick demo of how changesets works before we dive straight into CI/CD stuff. So in our package.json, let's actually create some scripts that can help us interface with changesets. So we're going to add a script section here. And first we're going to add a changeset script that just runs changeset via the changeset CLI. And what this changeset command does is creates a change set. And let's also add a script for version, which will do a change set version and appropriately update the version of our package based on whatever change sets exist. So again, let's demo how change sets works and everything. We're going to run these npm scripts that we just created. So first we're going to run npm run change set to create a change set. So let's say this change is a minor change. And for the summary, we'll say added change sets. We get a summary. Yes, that looks good. There we go. Change set created. And now let's create another change set. And let's make this one a major change. And what's something that would be a breaking change? How about remove the old interface, whatever that means. So here we go, major change. So we've created our change sets. And now if we come over to our .changeset directory, we can see the two change sets that we created. So these change sets, you actually commit them to source control. So for example, we'd commit them, don't commit node modules. We'll have to add that to git ignore, but we'll say something like add change sets. All right, so those were our changes. Now let's say we want to create a release. So of course we'd want to bump the version. So we're going to run npm run version, which will run change set version under the hood. So let's do that. Here we go. All right, completed. So what it did was it read all of the change sets that we had created and deleted them, but it ultimately used these change sets to determine the version bump. So since we had a major change and a minor change, it determined that we needed to do a major semantic version bump, which we can see in our package.json. We went from 1.4.0 to 2.0.0. So we did bump the major version. And another thing that's cool is it creates this changelog markdown file. So we can see all the changes based off what we put into our changeset file. So this is pretty cool. We can version everything locally. That's a pretty good start. So let's actually delete all of these changes minus node modules. Don't worry about that because versioning locally isn't going to cut it. So we'd have to manually run this version script and then grab the updated version in the package.json, copy that over to our CSproj file as the application display version, commit everything, and then manually kick off our deploy workflow. We don't want to do that. Instead, we're going to do this all in a GitHub Actions CI/CD pipeline. So again, just a refresher, as of right now, we have our single deploy workflow that runs on pushes to the master branch and actually reads the version from the CSproj file. And really all of this is going to stay the same. We're still going to read the version from the CSproj file actually, because that CSproj file version actually needs to be updated anyways before we build and publish, since our exe should have the right version attached. So that means before we get to any of this, we need a workflow that will update the version in our package.json file and then copy this version over to our CSproj file and then commit those changes and then merge them into master, push them to the master branch, and ultimately kick off this deploy workflow. And all of that is going to go in a separate workflow called version.yml. So this workflow, let's name it version, and we're going to run this on workflow dispatch. And basically what this trigger means is that we're going to go to the GitHub Actions tab in GitHub and just click a button to kick off the workflow, which is going to be really exciting because we're going to end up having a single button click that kicks off our deployment. Pretty fun stuff. Let's do it. So let's define our job. We're just going to have a single job. We'll call it build, I guess. We're just going to have one job in here. Shouldn't really matter what we name it. We're going to run this on Windows, which I guess we don't really have to because we're not doing any MAUI specific stuff or even .NET stuff in this job, as we'll see. But let's stick to Windows because I'm on Windows right now. And the good stuff, let's get into the steps. So obviously the first step is we want to check out our repo, and we actually want to do a fetch depth 0. So what this option does is it checks out all of the branches and commits, basically checks out your entire repo. And the reason we want to do this is because we're going to be doing some committing and then merging and then pushing code. So we're going to need the full repo in order to do those operations. We're also going to be running npm scripts. So we're going to have to set up node. I have version 21 installed. So we're going to roll with that. And next up, we're going to install our package.json dependencies. So basically installing change sets so that we have change sets whenever we run these scripts. So we're going to run an npm CI to install in our continuous deployment directory. Then at this point, we got everything we need. So we're going to run version, npm run version, that is, in our package.json. So that's going to bump the version based on all of our change sets. And now for the fun part. So we bumped our package.json version at this point, but we're still going to be relying on our CSproj version in our deploy workflow, which means we really want to sync this version that we just updated into our CS_proj file. And we want to do that in our workflow. So let's create a new step here for syncing the Changesets version over to our CS_proj file. We're going to be doing some very great PowerShell here. It's going to be fun, not even kidding. So let's run this. The first thing we're going to do is create some sort of package variable, which will be the result of getting the content from our raw package.json file, and then basically parsing that from JSON into a PowerShell object, which means we can take this package variable and just get the version. So this package variable basically represents our package.json file. So if we call .version, it'll give us back our version. So we got the version from our package.json, but we want to push that into our CS_proj file, which means we're going to have to read our CS_proj file. So to do that, we're going to read the CS_proj file as XML by calling getContent on our CS_proj file. And then we're going to take that XML and we want to dig into the project property group application display version. So here we go, project property group application display version. And we want to set that as the version from our package.json. And then we simply want to take that XML and save it back into our CS_proj file. So we read the XML, we update the application display version with our new version, courtesy of Changesets, and then we write that back into our CS_proj. Now, as you might recall from auto updates, we also need our version in the app installer file. So here we go, we got version 1.4.0.0 here, and we need to update this as well. So let's do that. Let's read all of the content as XML from our app installer file. And this actually needs to be formatted with another 0 at the end. So it'll be our version plus 0.0. So we can do some PowerShell string formatting here. So create a new variable and then do a string format with a 0.0 at the end. And then we're going to populate this 0 variable here with the version from our package.json. So if this version variable was 1.4.0, then this would evaluate to 1.4.0.0, which is what we want. So now we need to update this version on our app installer XML. So the path for that is app installer main package version. So here we go, app installer main package version. There we go, let's set it. And last but not least, we have to save our app installer XML back to our app installer file. So how about that? Was that fun? Yeah, it was fun. Let's move on. So at this point, we have our versions bumped everywhere. So now we can commit all these changes and eventually push them. So let's add another step here for committing the version bump. We need to specify who we are for Git. So let's just say we are a GitHub Actions bot, and we'll set our email as, I guess, just nothing. And then let's specify all the files that we want to commit. So our CS_proj file with the updated version, our app installer with the updated version, our changelog that Changesets creates, can't forget about that, our .changeset directory, so that'll have all of the changesets deleted at this point, and then our package.json with the updated version, and that should be it. And I do like to be specific about the files that we add here instead of just doing like a git add everything, because I have seen some weird files get added in these workflows. All right, so now we can commit everything. We'll say bump version. That should be good enough. Now let's push these changes. So another step here. So we're gonna do a push back to our repo, but I actually want this entire script to be run from develop. So we're gonna be pulling from develop, which we're actually not doing. Let's set the ref to develop, and then updating the version everywhere, committing it, pushing back to develop, and then merging these changes on develop into master, which is going to kick off our deploy workflow. So we're going to pull the latest changes on master, check out a local master branch from the latest changes on master from our repo, and then we're going to merge in basically everything from develop. So all of our changes and then the latest version bump that we just did. So basically cutting everything that needs to be released. And then we're going to push these changes up to master, which is going to kick off, again, our deploy workflow. So the reason I brought this new develop branch into play is so that we have a branch that can build up all of our changes and all of our change sets, which allows us to manually determine whenever we want to kick off a release. Whereas before, if we were just developing on the master branch, then basically every change would kick off a new release, and it would be kind of hard to do versioning. Which you might also wonder why I didn't just put all of this versioning stuff into the beginning of our deploy workflow. And the reason for that is because I like jobs that do commits and pushes to be separate. Because, for example, if all of this stuff was in the deploy workflow in the beginning, and then for some reason the deploy certificate stuff failed for some reason, then if we wanted to retry a deploy, it would require that all of this versioning stuff and commits and pushes would have to run again in the beginning of the pipeline. So jobs that commit and push code, I like to have separate. But also, all of this is kind of subjective. Every team is going to have different release processes. Some teams might push from a release branch instead. Maybe for this part of the version job, you'd want to create these changes as pull requests instead of manually committing them in the pipeline. And then another idea, you could have a develop to master pull request get created here instead of automatically pushing the code, which could be pretty cool because then you could see everything that's being cut in this release in a pull request that's easier and possible to review rather than just blindly pushing it here. So those are just some ideas. Play around with it. Try whatever you want. What we have here right now should work. Let's find out. So first, let's commit this version workflow. Let's actually update our git ignore as well to remove node modules. There we go. Let's commit that. So we'll say add version workflow. Let's push it. And as we talked about, we're assuming that all development goes on a develop branch. So let's create that. Let's do a git checkout develop. We need a -b to create a new branch. And then let's do a git push develop. And there we go. We got our develop branch. So now if we come over to our repo and go to actions, we got our version workflow over here now. And we can run this workflow with one click of a button. Here we go. All right, kicked off. We checked out develop, set up node, installed npm packages, bump the version with changesets, sync the changesets version, committed the version bump, that's good, but we failed to push the code. So we get a 403, which means this is likely a permissions issue. And I think the right permission here is the same one we're using for our deploy workflow. So we need write permission to contents. So let's add that. There we go. So let's commit this, add write permission, and push. Let's try again. I actually think we're gonna run into another issue, but let's find out first. Oh, and it did fail again, but this was because we used the workflow file from our master branch and we just committed this from develop. So let's run this again, but use our develop branch. Here we go. And there we go. Okay, so we were able to push to develop and also push the change to master, which means pushing the master should have kicked off our workflow for deploying, but it didn't. And that's because if you want your pushes from workflows to trigger other workflows, you have to pass a personal access token whenever you check out the repo. So we'll have to create one of those. Let's go to our profile, go to settings, scroll down, go to developer settings, personal access tokens. I believe fine grained tokens is what we want. Let's generate a new token. I'll call this continuous deployment actions. Let's only give it access to our repo, so MAUI tutorials. And I believe we have to give this read and write access to actions and also read and write access to contents. But that should be everything. Let's create the token. All right, so I copied the token over to my clipboard, not gonna share it, but back in our repo, let's go to settings and secrets and variables for actions. And let's create a new repository secret. We'll just call this pat, so personal access token. We'll paste in the secret and then I'm gonna click add secret. All right, got the pat. Now when we check out, we wanna pass this personal access token as the token. So let's add that. And then we also have to grant our workflow actions write permission, I believe. And this should be everything we need to kick off the next workflow to actually do the deployment. So let's commit this and push. Before we kick this off, I also just added another change set because our previous one did get processed. Our version was bumped to version 2.0.0. We just didn't kick off the deploy workflow. So after this, we should have 2.0.1 and our deploy should get kicked off. So let's run this from develop branch. All right, there we go. We got everything pushed. There we go. Deploy was kicked off. So we'll let this run. But if we go to our code, we should see our version bump did get processed. So there we go. We did a patch. So we got 2.0.1 now. We also updated the app installer. Looks good. And the package.json looks good. And all of our change sets got deleted. So there we go. Assuming our deploy workflow still works, we should have automatic versioning set up. I wish I could be more excited, but this was kind of exhausting. This was a lot. Let's summarize everything we did. So first we set up change sets so we can run our change set script to create a change set. And then we added the version script so that we could process all of our change sets and update the version appropriately. Then we added a new version workflow that we can run with a single click of a button. We check out our code from our new develop branch. We set up Node.js because Changesets is an NPM package. We install packages, which includes installing changesets. We run our version bump with all of our changesets, and then we do some majestic PowerShell to read the version from our package.json, which was just updated by changesets. We sync that over to our CS project file, also sync it over to our app installer file. Then we commit all of the changes, push those to develop, and then merge develop into master, which, since we have the right permissions set up now, and we're using our personal access token, that'll kick off the deploy workflow, which deploys a new version of our application, which we can go ahead and install. Here we go, version 2.0.1, awesome. And we've accomplished continuous deployment with a single click of a button. So I'll leave it at that. Links, documentation, source code, everything will be in the description, but hopefully you can apply this to your own applications for fully automated versioning and deployments that you can kick off with a single click of a button.